There's a strange quiet that sets in when the performance ends. Not the one on stage, the one you didn't even realize you were giving for years. The one that starts in childhood, when you laugh a little harder than you feel, nod a little sooner than you understand, smile just to keep the room calm. And over time, that smile becomes permanent. That nod becomes instinct. And who you actually are starts to disappear beneath the version of you that made everyone else more comfortable. It's subtle. No one tells you you're acting. No one hands you a script. But somehow, you still find yourself reciting lines. Lines like, I'm fine. Lines like, no worries. Lines like, whatever you need. Even when your chest is heavy and your silence is screaming, that's the thing about pretending. It doesn't feel like pretending. It feels like survival. Until one day, the cost starts to show. Not in your bank account or your reputation, but in the way you wake up in the morning, in the way you look in the mirror and feel nothing, in the way you get praised and it doesn't reach you, in the way people love you and you still feel alone, because they're loving the mask, not you. They're responding to a version of you that you've outgrown but are too afraid to shed. And no one told you how heavy it would be to carry around a self that was never yours. So you keep adjusting. You keep managing expectations. You keep saying yes when you mean no, and staying quiet when you want to scream, and smiling when you want to leave. Until one day you wonder, what would happen if I just stopped? Stopped trying to hold it all together. Stopped trying to live up to an image that doesn't feel like mine. Stopped pretending to be unaffected, agreeable, invincible. Stopped giving so much energy to being someone I'm not. Not because I want to be dramatic, not because I want attention, but because I can't breathe in this suit of armor anymore. Because somewhere along the way, I confused self-control with self-abandonment. I confused being accepted with being erased. Carl Jung once wrote, "We meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life." And maybe that's what this is. Not a breakdown, not a crisis, but an unmasking. A moment where the disguise gets too tight and you realize that the only way forward is to let who you pretended to be fall apart. Not all at once, not in some dramatic explosion, but quietly, honestly, in small moments where you stop editing yourself mid-sentence, where you admit what you really want, even if it disappoints someone, where you sit with your truth long enough to recognize its shape. It's messy, of course. You won't always know what's real and what was raw. Sometimes the mask feels safer than the rawness beneath it. But there's a certain peace that starts to grow when you stop negotiating your identity just to avoid discomfort. You don't need to throw away your past or hate the version of you that got you here. They were doing their best. They were protecting you. They were trying to keep you loved, safe, included. But now, it's time to outgrow them. Gently, deliberately, with reverence. Because the truth is, your real self isn't fragile. It's just been buried. It's just been waiting. And the moment you stop performing, you give it permission to come alive. Because going back would mean abandoning something sacred. It would mean silencing the voice that finally started to speak in your own language or unfiltered, not dressed up for applause. It would mean betraying the strange and sacred feeling that you're finally telling the truth, not to them, but to yourself. There's a point in this unraveling where things get quiet. Not peaceful, not yet, but quiet like a house after a storm, where the walls are still dripping, but the wind has finally stopped howling. You sit there among the pieces of the self you used to project, the smiles, the polished opinions, the predictable affirmations, and you don't rush to rebuild because part of you knows maybe this collapse was never destruction. Maybe it was an invitation not to reinvent, but to remember, to go back not in time, but in essence, to the version of you that existed before the world had a name for you, before you were a job title, before you were someone's partner, before you were useful, because that's what pretending does. It trades aliveness for utility. It teaches you to be manageable, helpful, likable, but it quietly robs you of the fierce beauty that only comes from being whole. Not easy, not nice, whole. And the world doesn't know what to do with wholeness. It knows how to reward fragments, the obedient parts, the charming parts, the marketable parts, but it does not know how to hold someone who won't fracture for convenience. So when you stop pretending, you don't just risk rejection, you risk being misunderstood by people who only ever knew your mask. But that misunderstanding is a price you must be willing to pay if what you want is a life that's actually yours, not one constructed from applause, not one curated for approval, but one built on the quiet, unwavering knowledge that even if nobody gets it, you do. That you no longer need to explain yourself to be real. That your worth was never dependent on being understood. That you can stand alone if you must and still feel the ground beneath your feet say, yes, this is where you belong. Because here's the truth, that pretending kept you from realizing there is no version of you more lovable than the one you truly are. Not the more agreeable you, not the more humble you, not the more selfless you. Just you as you are, flawed, complex, untamed. You don't need to become someone else to be worthy. You need to unbecome everything you built to hide your real face. You need to stop asking for permission to be human. And that includes the parts you've tried to bury. The sharp edges, the inconvenient emotions, the hungers that don't fit the mold, the truths that make others uncomfortable. Let them all in. Because if you only accept the parts of yourself that make others feel safe, you are still performing. True freedom comes not from being liked, but from being whole in your own presence, from not needing to split yourself just to keep the room calm, from knowing that the version of you that finally feels like home is worth the risk of being alone. Because anything less is a slow death in disguise. And once you see that, once you feel the hollowness of a life lived for others, even when it looks full from the outside, something begins to shift in your center. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's something quieter than defiance, but stronger than resistance. You just stop trying. Not in defeat, but in clarity. You stop trying to be more agreeable, more inspiring, more digestible. You stop trying to meet expectations that were never yours to begin with. And in that stillness, in that radical refusal to keep editing yourself to fit an inherited script, you meet something ancient in you. Something that remembers how to breathe without shrinking, remembers how to speak without flinching, remembers how to feel joy that isn't staged and grief that isn't apologized for. And suddenly, you're no longer watching your life from the sidelines. You're in it, not as a spectator of your own performance, but as a full breathing participant. Not worrying whether the light hits you right or whether your words will be misinterpreted. Because now, there's no longer a separation between your inner world and the self you show. You are no longer a diplomat negotiating your existence. You are simply here. It's jarring at first how bare it feels. How few words you suddenly have when you're no longer performing. How much silence there is when you stop filling every gap with what's expected. But stay in that silence. There is gold in it. There is something sacred about not rushing to justify, to explain, to decorate your truth with politeness, because that's what pretending does. It fills silence with noise, fills presence with posture. It teaches you to answer before you're ready, to agree before you've felt, to conform before you've asked if you want to. But now you're beginning to let time return to you. You no longer answer reflexively. You pause. You breathe. You check in with your body before your image. And slowly, without needing to be announced, your real self becomes visible. Not because you declared it, but because you no longer smother it. And people will feel the difference. Some will pull away, not knowing why. Some will draw nearer, not knowing why. Because truth has a frequency. And when you start living in it, it disrupts the patterns that depended on your silence. But you won't be shaken, because the ground beneath you now is not approval. It is alignment. And alignment doesn't tremble when opinions shift. It listens, it adapts, but it doesn't bend into falsehood. That's the true power of letting the mask fall. Not that you become loud, but that you become immovable in a quiet way. Not stubborn, just deeply rooted. You start to realize that much of what the world called strength was just overcompensation. And much of what it called weakness was actually sensitivity, insight, clarity. And so the traits you once disowned, your slowness, your softness, your reluctance to please, you begin to reclaim them. Not as flaws, but as sacred signals, as evidence that your compass is no longer outside of you. And once your compass is internal, everything changes. Because when the compass moves inside, the world outside stops being the master. It becomes the mirror, not the judge, not the source, just a mirror. It reflects, it reveals, it triggers, but it no longer defines. And this subtle but seismic shift is the birth of true vision. Not vision in the way the world sells its goals, achievements, accolades, but vision in the way the soul understands it. The ability to see beyond the role you were assigned, to look past survival, to imagine something untouched by the performance. It starts small. You begin questioning what you once called normal. You stop moving through your days on autopilot. You feel discomfort in rooms where you once felt proud to be included. You hear a voice in you that interrupts the old scripts. The scripts of I should, scripts of I must, scripts of this is just how it is. And that voice isn't loud, but it's unshakable. It's the voice of your own becoming, not the becoming of someone new, but the unearthing of someone ancient, the part of you that was never damaged by the world, only buried beneath it. This is the turning point, where learning begins. Not the kind of learning that fills you with more facts, but the kind that strips away illusions. You begin learning not to react, but to observe, not to perform, but to respond, not to fit in, but to belong to yourself. You learn that boundaries are not walls, but acts of clarity, that saying no is not rejection, but protection, that your discomfort around certain people is not a flaw in you, but a signal of misalignment. You learn to trust your own nervous system again, to see anxiety not as a disorder, but as a message. Something here isn't true. And as you continue, vision expands. You begin seeing patterns show you inherited fears that weren't yours, how you repeated roles you swore you'd escape, how you kept waiting for external validation to finally say, yes, now you are real, but now you see through it. The validation you craved was never about worth. It was about direction. It was a compass error. You were navigating with someone else's map. But now the map dissolved. And what's left is a landscape of your own mind, untamed, vivid, unfinished. And finally, you have the courage to explore it. That exploration, real inner learning, doesn't come from fixing yourself. It comes from seeing yourself. It comes from asking better questions. Not how do I become more likable, but what parts of me have I disowned in order to be accepted? Not how do I succeed, but what does success mean when I'm no longer pretending? This is not self-help. This is self-remembering. And with each layer you peel back, your vision sharpens. You begin to move with intention, not momentum. You no longer run from discomfort, because now you understand discomfort is a door. And behind every door is a piece of you thought you had to kill in order to belong. You let go of urgency. You let go of the chase. You let go of the myth that healing is a finish line. Because now you see clarity isn't a goal, it's a way of walking, a way of breathing, a way of not abandoning yourself in the name of harmony. And as vision deepens, you start to feel something you haven't felt in years. A sense of direction that doesn't come from desperation. You're not chasing anymore. You're aligning. You're not reacting to the world. You're responding from a center the world can't shake. That's when the real shift happens. Your life stops being a performance. It becomes a practice. Not a performance of who you think you should be, but a practice of returning every day to who you are, unfolding, revealing, living not for the eyes on you, but for the truth within you. And this practice, this daily returning, it's not always graceful. Some days you wake up and the old roles are already waiting. They slide onto your skin like second nature, whispering, it's easier this way. Just be who they expect. And maybe on those days you do. Maybe you play along halfway just to keep the noise down. But even then, something's different. Because now you know it's an act. And knowing that changes everything. You no longer mistake the mask for your face. You wear it maybe, but it no longer fits. It pinches. It itches. It weighs more than it ever did before. And that discomfort, it's a gift. It means you've outgrown it. Growth, it turns out, is not just about rising. It's about shedding. Shedding illusions, identities, obligations that never belong to your soul. And in their place, you don't always find clarity right away. Sometimes you just find space. Space where the noise used to be. Space where the performance used to live. And at first it feels empty. But slowly, that emptiness becomes sacred. It becomes the soil where vision plants itself. Not a vision based on conquest or control, but a vision that emerges like breath. Quiet, vital, steady. A vision that isn't rushed. Because now, you're not moving to prove anything. You're moving because something real in you wants to grow. That's when learning becomes devotion. Not to a system, not to a plan, but to yourself, your unfolding, your rhythm, your truth. You start noticing what actually nourishes you. What conversations leave you lighter. What work makes you forget time. What silences feel like home. And you protect those things. Not with rigidity, but with reverence. Because now you know what you allow is what teaches the world how to treat you. What you tolerate becomes your rhythm. What you normalize becomes your identity. So you start choosing differently. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. not to escape pain, but to honor peace. Because now the mask has fallen, and what remains is someone who's no longer willing to betray themselves to keep others comfortable. That's what happens when the pretending ends. You begin to live from the inside out. And every decision, every boundary, every yes and no, it all becomes part of the same practice, staying close to what's real, no matter the cost. You stop seeking approval like a drug. You stop rearranging your truth to avoid awkwardness. You stop explaining yourself in circles just to be understood. Because now, understanding is no longer the goal. Being fully, deeply, honestly, and even when it's hard, even when it costs you the crowd, you keep choosing truth, not because it's easy, but because it's sacred, because it's the only thing that has ever felt like home. Because what you've reclaimed is not just identity, it's sovereignty. And sovereignty doesn't beg, it doesn't audition, it doesn't sit waiting for someone else to decide if it's worthy. It knows. It walks into silence with its head high. It stands in rejection and does not collapse. It looks into the eyes of the world and says, I will not trade my soul for your comfort. That's not ego. That's remembrance. The remembrance that who you are, underneath every role, every scar, every carefully crafted facade was never broken, only buried. And now, unearthed, you don't need to rise to some imagined version of greatness. You need to return to the ground beneath your own name, to the voice inside you that whispers, you were never the mask, to the strength that was never about force, but about truth, lived unapologetically. This is the climax of it all, not the end of pain, not the disappearance of fear, but the death of self-abandonment, the final breath of the version of you that said yes when you meant no, that smiled while dying inside, that stayed silent just to keep the peace. Let them go. Let that version fall, not with guilt, not with shame, but with reverence, because they were not the enemy. They were your shield. They were your training ground. They carried you until you could walk as yourself. And now you can, not because you have all the answers, but because you finally stopped asking for permission to be real. From here on, every breath you take is yours. Every decision you make is yours. Every inch of your life begins to reflect the wild, unfiltered truth of you. No more bending, no more acting, no more hiding behind the armor of who they needed you to be. You are not here to be a mirror for others' comfort. You are here to burn quietly, fiercely, fully, to be a living example that wholeness is not a performance, it's a revolution. And now that you've remembered, don't you dare forget again.